My name is Justin Reich. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've taught my whole life. When I graduated from college, I taught things like wilderness medicine and lifeguarding, and then I was a high school history teacher, and eventually found my way into education technology and teaching that in higher education. The role that technology plays in teaching and learning is to empower learners to take more responsibility for their learning. When I started teaching, I had the good fortune in the early 2000s to teach in a classroom with a cart of laptops and an intranet program called First Class that did just about everything that Google Suite for Education does now. And what was so exciting about it to me is it let my students connect to a world of resources. It let them collaborate with each other, with people outside our classrooms, with people out, beyond the school walls. I think technology at its best helps students be more empowered to take control of their learning. I think technology developers make two kinds of mistakes when they communicate to folks in schools. And they could be, if they were more honest about these things and more realistic about these things, they'd be more successful. So one is technology developers often describe their tools as sort of sweeping and comprehensive. But in fact, most of our technology tools do specific things well for certain students in certain contexts in certain courses. Like we've built as a society some reasonably good cognitive tutors that provide students with learning experiences, give them a chance to show what they know, assess them, give them new ideas. They only work in a couple of subject areas. They work in a few domains in math. They work a little bit in early language acquisition, but not very well in later language acquisition. We have some pretty good ones in computer science. We basically have none in science and social studies that are any good. So here's a tool that's useful, but you can't go to schools in the field and be like, cognitive tutors, intelligent tutors, AI, it's the future of all learning. It's not. It's like good for a certain number of things. And then education technology developers tell folks, look, that this technology is just like something you flip on like a switch. Just download this on student machines and you'll see powerful learning. And you won't. Every technology solution is a human capital problem. Every time we introduce new technologies into schools, we have to teach students and families about new routines. Instructors need to figure out new ways of incorporating these things. Those are two things that we often have not been very good at, trying to figure out how a particular technology fits within a particular part of the ecosystem, like what niche does it fill? And then what are all the human supports we need to provide to the different communities who use education technology to have them be powerful and effective? So as educators are making choices about what technologies to use, one of the pieces of advice I have in this book that I've written, Failure to Disrupt, is there's almost nothing that we've created that's new. Human beings, from the very first days of computing, since computers were the size of your living room, computer scientists have partnered with learning scientists to make technologies that help students learn. This is a 65-year initiative, and we've tried a lot of stuff. So if some developer comes to you and say, we have this brand new, totally different thing, it's not brand new and totally different. It's a modification of something that already exists. And so what you need to do is say, oh, okay, the thing that I'm seeing here, it's actually like these other things. And for most stuff that we've tried, we've had some research about it. We know that it works better in these circumstances than those circumstances for serving these kinds of students versus those kinds of students. It has these kinds of pitfalls which have held us up that we have to figure out how to get over. So one of the best things that we can do when we think about and select new technologies, think about like, how has this been used before? Who does it work for? What subjects does it work for? And sort of what are the consequences of that? I mean, the second big idea in adopting new technologies is that as much as possible, we want technology adoption to be driven by learning goals. As much as possible, if you're a school leader, you don't want your teachers to feel like they're participating in a technology initiative. You want them to feel like they're participating in a learning initiative. Man, we're having a real challenge helping our students develop reading fluency by the 3rd grade. what are the technologies that might be able to help that problem, not, sort of what are the technologies that we want to deploy in schools and how do we find problems for them to solve. So those are a couple of ways of thinking about technology adoption in schools. In the United States, we have 13,000 school districts and about 130,000 schools. And one of the things that's challenging about supporting school leaders is that there are actually different solutions across all of those different environments, maybe not unique to every 130,000 schools. There are some places where, for a variety of reasons, including, maybe being in neighborhoods where families had a lot of resources, or just a history of practicing and playing around with technology long before the pandemic, where remote learning went pretty well. And students felt like they had some pretty good distance learning experiences and they developed some new technology skills. In those kinds of environments, schools coming back, there might be a whole bunch of teachers and students who are like, we're ready to do some more technology incorporation in what we're doing. There are other places, particularly places, for instance, with real challenges with network connectivity, where remote learning was perceived as somewhere between disappointing and disastrous. For a lot of young people, for a lot of teachers, they're looking to get away from these technology-mediated communications. They want to go back to more face-to-face kinds of things. So the answer to that question somewhat is based on the needs of your community. I bet there are going to be some really great schools across the United States, across Asia, that say, oh, that technology was too much, and it didn't work well for all the things that we want to do. And we want to, especially in the next year or two, ratchet that way back and really focus on reconnecting face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball as human beings. And that could be a good solution in some places. There could also be some other places that say, wow, a bunch of this remote learning really worked well for us. In fact, we want to sort of permanently change our schedule to accommodate somewhat more of that. Maybe we want to set up the mornings or 4 days a week as sort of face-to-face classes and have 1 day a week to continue some of these remote learning practices, that in secondary schools, let students get jobs or let them do internships in the city or other things like that. So a challenge to all these kinds of questions is that there's not one good right answer to them. There is one great way of answering these questions, which is, for almost any of these design decisions that we have for moving forward, start by talking to students and teachers. There is exactly one generation of young people across Asia, across the world, that has been to school during a global pandemic. And it's not people my age. It's not people who just graduated, who've graduated a few years from going to college and are young teachers. It's the young people who are in our classrooms right now. They have a unique set of experiences. Normally the adults in the building kind of know all the stuff about how schools work and have a lot of experience. This is an experience they don't have as students. And so talking to young people, starting with the questions like, what worked really well for you with technology assisted learning, with remote learning? What didn't work really well for you? What are you hoping the future of schools looks like for the next couple of years? If we lead our designs from the people who are closest to these challenges, that's going to be the right first steps to take. So I'm sure it's different in different places in the world. In the United States, one of the things that the pandemic revealed is, which we've known, but we saw in new and powerful ways, is the vast chasm of inequalities between schools serving more affluent and less affluent students, and really a total widespread failure of our society to provide for the basic social welfare of young people and their families. In the United States, like an embarrassing, terrible tragedy is that we overwhelmingly depend on schools for the social safety net for young people and their families, which is nuts, because what we should depend on schools to do is to teach young people. And then there should be other kinds of institutions in society that make sure that their homes and apartments are connected to Wi-Fi, that make sure that they have enough to eat and a safe place to stay, and healthcare and mental health screening and things like that. I'm sure, across your constituencies in Asia, you'll find different countries with different responses. I know, I've definitely talked to some Asian educators, Asian policymakers who have said, look, this is a great moment for us to think about leveling some of the playing field as a society. We know that the future involves more interruption in schools. We've added 1 degree Celsius of temperature to the planet Earth, and we see more fires, more floods, more freezing events. We're going to see more diseases that move from the tropics to the temperate regions. We see more things like pandemics. Schools are going to close more often and have more interruptions, in the next century than they did in the past century. Really great, robust school systems are going to have ways of making sure that kids can continue their learning even when it's not safe to go together to be in buildings. And the only way to do that equitably is to think about what's a baseline level of broadband access and technology access. I'm sure Asian countries have this experience, but in the United States, in the 19th century, we said, or in the early part of the 20th century, the 1900s, we said, hey, it's not okay that there are homes that don't have electricity. We need every home to be connected to electricity. And there's no one who went to the local school principal and said, hey, local school principal, you got to run some telephone poles out to the rural villages or to the tenements in your city to make sure that they have power. No, we built other institutions that electrified the country. We need to do the same thing with broadband. And we can't do it by going to the local head teacher and be like, we need you to roll fiber optic cable up the holler. Like, that's not the job of schools. It's got to be the job of other parts of society to make sure that there's a baseline so that the kinds of inequalities that you were just describing and that we saw in powerful ways in the pandemic don't become exacerbated. Yeah, we do build tools in my lab, the teaching systems lab. It might not surprise you based on what we say before that the things that we build are really good at particular things. So we're actually really interested in helping teachers learn. So we build practice spaces, digital clinical simulations. We think teachers don't have enough opportunities to practice when they learn. So we give them more opportunities to practice. And we don't believe that they're magical teacher learning tools that you just download on people's machines and they magically become better teachers. But we think in the context of robust professional learning systems, simulations can be a way to make those experiences even more powerful for folks. As far as I can tell, across the world, there were 2 technologies that dominated the pandemic. And they're actually 2 of our very oldest technologies. So if you look what happened during the pandemic, there were very few places that made huge adoptions of artificial intelligence or learning analytics or massive open online courses or VR, AR, or any of that stuff. They used 2 things. The first things that schools adopted were learning management systems, things like Google Classroom or Schoology or Canvas. I'm sure there's other alternatives across the Asia Pacific region. And these are tools that were theorized in the 1960s and 1970s. They were commercialized in the 1990s and they were made open source in the 2000s. So things that we have decades of experience with. And what learning management systems do is they basically help us pass documents back and forth. Like my daughter has a folder in her backpack. She's an elementary school student. And one side says to home and one side says to school. And learning management systems kind of let us do that. The second dominant technology of the pandemic, when it was introduced in the 1930s, was called video telephony, but we call it video conferencing now. And it sort of nominally lets a group of people come together, and it lets you see a speaker and sort of lets the speaker see some fraction of people who are listening. Teaching through Zoom is a little bit like teaching through a keyhole. You can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side with some awkward straining, but it's not really conducive to meaningful conversations. So what we found is that all across the world, these are kind of the 2 dominant tools of pandemic learning. And probably one thing that we should do is figure out everything we can about how to teach well with the things that lots and lots of people are using. So if these are kind of our baseline tools, let's do everything we can in our schools to help people figure out, what really effective practice looks like in video conferencing. What are the most effective ways to communicate and help support student learning through learning management systems. And there are some things that work really well in these systems that actually don't work as well face-to-face. So for instance, we spent a lot of time with the pandemic. We've interviewed over 100 teachers. We've had over 250 teachers interview about 5,000 of their students and send some of that information back to us. One of the things that comes up over and over again is how much teachers and students appreciate the back channel that video conferencing allows. They really like the Zoom chat. They're sort of trying to figure, like, the Zoom chat, it lets any student ping me at any time without disrupting the flow of class. It lets introverted or shy or anxious or quieter students say something just to me that no one else can hear, or say something to the whole class. It lets all of us really quickly sort of put our ideas up in one place. There are a lot of teachers who are now thinking, like, how do we take that Zoom chat thing and bring it into the in-person class? I'm actually, I'm teaching my Introduction to Media Studies class this semester face-to-face again after teaching it online. And a couple of the activities that I did online, they don't work as well face-to-face, and I'm trying to think about how to re-engineer them. A sort of curious thing about MIT students is that they're very unlikely to bring computers to class. Most of the classes that they take have a lot of math in them, and computers are not good at taking notes in math. So they almost all take notes either on a tablet, that's a little more common now, but on paper. And so it's been interesting to try to find, some things we did, like take a screenshot of a quote you really like and put it all up on a slide so that we can all look at it. That's a lot harder to do in person. So, here I am, and nominally I'm an expert in these things, and I'm sort of wrestling too with how do I take some of the things that worked really well last year that I'm really excited about and bring them back into a classroom where there are still enormous advantages of being able to be face-to-face with my students, put my hand on their shoulder when they're having a tough day, those kinds of things. I'll tell you what teachers are telling us. So we interviewed 60 teachers recently about their experience last year in the pandemic. And if there was a common theme about professional learning, it was that the professional learning that teachers received, it taught them how to click the buttons of a tool, but not how to teach with the tool. So at the beginning of this last academic year, there were a bunch of schools that rolled out some kind of video conferencing tool to let people work synchronously. And what we heard over and over again from teachers was, okay, well, I got some training about how to get my students to log in, and I got some training about where the share screen button was and what some of the features were and things like that. But there wasn't any training available on what does teaching math well in video conferencing look like? What does teaching social studies? What does teaching language look like really well? So part of the capacity that really great schools and school systems need to develop is that there need to be partnerships between people who do instructional technology stuff and people who do sort of instructional design and learning, and say, okay, as a district, as a system, we're going to use this new tool. You're going to need a little bit of the how to click the buttons professional development. But what we really need to be able to provide for you is some examples, some models, some practices of what really good teaching and learning looks like in these venues. I'll give you one specific example that just caught my eye from this year. There was an elementary school math coach that asked the question, we're doing things with fractions and with number lines. Do kids need to draw their own number lines, or can they use some kind of copy and pasted digital number line? Is it good for them to draw on a piece of paper and mark out 1 and 2 and 3 and find all the fractions in between? Or is it okay to make an image of that and copy and paste it into a slide or something like that? That is a very, very rich pedagogical question. That has a bunch of interesting dimensions to it. If your answer is that the kids need to draw it themselves and we need to watch them do it, that's very complicated through video conferencing software. Now you're thinking to yourself, how do I help each kid create their own local document camera? Do I teach them how to take pictures and upload it? In a classroom, this is just a trivial problem. You hand kids a bunch of rulers and a bunch of pencils and you say, draw number lines, and you walk around the room and you watch for the kid who's drawing squiggly lines instead of straight ones, and you go and sit behind them and help them get back on track. But these, the other thing I love about that question in that moment is it's for 3 or 4 days in class in 4th grade. You have to answer questions like that in every subject for every unit across all 12 grades. And you realize it's just lots and lots of kinds of questions. So that's what school systems, to the extent that school systems keep adopting new forms of technology assisted instruction, that's the kind of professional learning and that's the kind of granularity they need to be able to provide. Not just what, you start with what does it look like to teach math well through video conferencing, but then you got to ask questions like, what does it look like to teach a 4th grade unit on number lines and fractions really well in video conferencing? The signature, the way to think about the opportunities of this period is to ask the question, what are the skills and proficiencies that students developed during this time that they wouldn't have otherwise? What are the new assets that young people are bringing to our classrooms that we might not expect otherwise? And there's 2 big things. Our students had a lot of practice with technology-mediated learning. They're much better at it now. Not every single one of them. Some students were excluded from this learning because they didn't have good connectivity and things like that. But for the folks who were able to get connected, they were just forced to practice and get better at lots of things that we can tap into for the rest of their academic careers. And the second thing is that students were forced to develop new kinds of self-regulated independent learning skills. Many of them had a really hard time with that. For a lot of young people, for a lot of adults, it's really hard to learn at home alone. But there are lots and lots of people who learned tremendous skills about independent self-directed learning, and school systems should figure out how to take advantage of that. We interviewed one teacher who was talking with her students and sent us some things back and said, one of the things that we realized is that one of teachers' common but not great qualities is that when students are really struggling, we scoop in and do the hard stuff for them. It pains us to watch students like really at that moment of struggle. And so maybe we jump in too often too early. Well, teachers couldn't jump in too often too early when their kids were really at a distance. And so in those really hard moments, there's some students who figured it out, who pushed forward and persevered. For that particular teacher, she was coming back into her school saying, how do I give more of that space for students to really push through and persevere in these hard moments and build on their newfound confidence that they can do that. Of course, some students really struggle with that, so it's different for every kid. But that was one of the things that we heard that we thought was pretty powerful. Well, I'm really excited to be able to speak at EDUtech Asia this year. And the audience that joins us is going to hear some of the research that we've done over the pandemic about where students and teachers found challenges and where they thrived. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the lessons from this new book I've written with Harvard University Press called Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. And the core messages of that book really are about recognizing that it's not technology that's going to swoop in and transform and save educational systems. I don't think you could find a country in the world that you could go to and say, oh, look, education's great now because during the pandemic, we had to add a bunch of technology to it. Technology can be really powerful, but it is only as powerful as the communities that support its use. So what I'm really trying to help schools work on is how do you build the capacity of the human beings in your system to be able to use technology in thoughtful and powerful ways.